Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really trying to cut through the noise, get underneath the surface of structural inequality here in the U.S.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're going to unpack four key areas.
Yeah.
Wealth, employment, debt, and housing.
And how they all connect.
Exactly. How these interconnected issues impact, not just the economy, but our democracy, really, and the future for whole generations.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal here is to give you some, hopefully, surprising facts and clear insights so you can be truly well-informed.
Yeah, move beyond the headlines.
Right. So to really get to the heart of it, we need to ask some hard questions. The kind that maybe make us squirm a little.
The uncomfortable ones.
Yeah. Like, what do we accept it as just normal that the richest 1% have more wealth than the other 99% combined?
It sounds unbelievable when you say it like that.
And what does full employment actually mean if millions have to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to get by?
Right. What does that number really represent?
Is it fair, is it ethical for young people to start adult life owing more money than they actually possess?
A huge burden from day one.
And what kind of democracy are we building when most people rent, but a small minority collects properties like monopoly pieces just as investments?
Who has the stake?
Then there's the philanthropy of the super rich. Is that a real solution, or is it maybe a bit of a smokescreen? A way to avoid paying fair taxes?
That's a controversial one.
And can a whole generation really build families, build communities, if they're stuck renting permanently?
What does that do to social fabric?
And zooming out, that promise of global capitalism, was it really progress for everyone, or just for those who are already, ahead?
Big questions.
They are. And to explore them, we've looked at a whole stack of pretty powerful sources, official reports from the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Census Bureau.
Alongside data from places like the World Inequality Lab, Oxfam.
Yeah, and recent academic studies, too. So we're trying to ground this in real data. Okay, so let's dive into that first really unsettling question. Why does it feel so normal? Why is it so accepted that the richest 1% own more than everyone else?
Yeah, it's quite striking when you look at the numbers, how concentrated wealth really has become.
Globally and here in the U.S.
Both. Globally, the richest 1%, they own somewhere between, 43% and maybe even over 50% of all wealth. It's hard to even picture.
Over half. Wow.
And the top 10%, they hold about 85%. Astonishing, really.
Leaving just 15% for the other 90% of people.
Precisely. And if we zoom in on the U.S., it's similarly dramatic. By late 2021, the top 1% here held about 31% of U.S. wealth.
Okay. And the bottom half, the majority of people.
The bottom half held, get this, just 2.6%.
2.6%, that's stark.
It is. And historically, back in 1989, the 1% held around 23%.
So it's actually gotten significantly more concentrated.
It's definitely a climbing trend. We're seeing levels we really haven't seen since before the mid-20th century.
So how does this happen? How does this kind of privilege just keep going?
Well, that's the crucial question, isn't it? How does it perpetuate itself? There are a few key things going on. First, there's the powerful meritocracy narrative.
Right, the idea that if you work hard, you'll succeed, and huge fortunes are just earned.
Exactly. It presents these massive fortunes as purely the result of individual brilliance or effort. But it often, conveniently, glosses over factors like, inheritance or existing class advantages or who those power networks.
Okay, so the story we tell ourselves matters.
Immensely. Then there are the actual economic and fiscal policies. Since the 1980s especially, we've seen policies that have disproportionately favored the wealthy.
Like what specifically?
Things like financial deregulation, big tax cuts, especially on capital income,
Right.
The money made from investments rather than wages. That allows wealth to accumulate much faster at the very top.
Got it.
And of course, wealth reproduces itself. Inheritance is a huge factor. Did you know over 60% of billionaire wealth actually comes from legacies?
60%. So much for pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Well, yeah, or it comes from structures specifically designed to keep fortunes within a very small group of families.
Okay.
And finally, you can't ignore political influence.
Money in politics.
Absolutely. These economic elites, they fund campaigns, they fund extensive lobbying efforts, they make sure the laws are written or stay written in ways that protect their financial interests.
Like keeping those capital taxes low, we mentioned.
Precisely. It creates this self-reinforcing cycle. More wealth means more influence.
Which they use to get policies that generate even more wealth.
You got it. It locks in that advantage.
That's a really powerful framework.
Yeah.
So the aha moment isn't just that wealth is concentrated.
No.
It's that the concentration is actively reinforced by the stories we tell, the policies we enact, how wealth is passed down, and political influence.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult for the majority to gain ground, regardless of how hard individuals work. It really challenges that whole idea of a level playing field.
It really does. And if that's happening at the top, how does it change things for everyone else, like the definition of work, economic security?
Yeah.
Because we hear this term full employment all the time in the news.
Right. Presented as a sign everything's great.
But then you look around, you talk to people, and you see something really different. So what does full employment actually mean when so many people need multiple jobs just to survive?
This really gets to the heart of how we measure economic health, doesn't it? Because those official statistics, they can be pretty deceiving.
How so?
Well, take May 2025. The official U.S. unemployment rate was around 4.2%.
Which sounds low. Traditionally, full employment.
Right. By traditional metrics, that looks good. But then there's this broader measure called U6.
Okay, what does that include?
Crucially, U6 includes people working part-time who want full-time work but can't find it. That's involuntary part-time. And it also includes people who've just given up looking.
The discouraged workers.
Exactly. And that U6 rate, it was 7.8%.
So almost double the official rate. That's a big difference.
It's a significant number of people who aren't fully participating in the way they want to or need to.
Yeah.
And one really striking point the data shows is the surge in people holding multiple jobs.
The side hustle becoming a necessity.
Pretty much. About 5.2% of all workers, that's 8.6 million people as of May 2025, hold more than one job.
8.6 million.
And that number's been climbing steadily since 2020. It's hitting levels we haven't really seen since before the Great Recession.
And what's driving that?
It seems largely driven by the rising cost of living, inflation.
Yeah.
People just can't cover basic expenses on one income stream anymore.
So they piece things together.
Right. And then you also have the whole gig economy factor.
Uber, DoorDash, that kind of work.
Yeah, millions working as independent contractors.
Yeah.
And many of these workers aren't even accurately captured in the formal employment statistics. They're often classified as self-employed.
So they might be undercounted.
Definitely. Some research suggests up to maybe 7 million gig workers could be undercounted. It reveals this much larger sort of hidden sector of precarious labor.
Wow. So it brings up a critical question then. The jobs being created, are they actually good jobs?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? A big chunk of the new positions are in low-wage sectors. Think hospitality, retail.
Often without benefits or much stability.
Exactly. So yes, the U.S. economy is generating jobs on paper, but it's not always ensuring those jobs are enough for a household to meet basic needs without having to juggle multiple incomes, often without a safety net.
It really highlights a crucial disconnect. That macro-level full employment number doesn't necessarily translate to security or, frankly, a decent quality of life for individuals.
It's a stark contrast, puts the numbers in perspective.
Definitely. And, this leads us right into another really uncomfortable area, especially for younger generations.
Debt.
Yeah. Is it actually ethical for millions of young people to start their adult lives already deeply in debt, owing more, potentially, than they actually own?
It's a profound issue, and the ethical questions are serious. Just look at student loan debt.
The numbers are staggering.
They really are. The average federal debt per borrower was around $38,375 by late 2024.
$38,000
Yeah.
per person.
And that affects over 42.8 million people.
42 million.
Yeah. That adds up to a staggering $1.6 trillion in total student debt across the country.
1.6 trillion. It's more than the GDP of many countries.
Held by individuals just trying to start out. And compare that to previous generations, a university graduate back in the 1980s might have left with maybe less than $15,000 in debt, even adjusted for inflation.
A huge difference.
You know?
And how does that impact their overall financial health, their net worth?
Well, that's where it gets really illuminating. The median net worth for households led by someone under 35 is only about $39,000.
$39,000. That's not much of a cushion.
Not at all. And for many young people, especially if they're trying to balance student debt and maybe a mortgage or just high rent, they end up with a net worth close to zero, or even negative.
Starting out behind.
Essentially, yes. They're constantly paying interest, often just treading water, not actually building any assets.
And looking bigger picture.
Well, look at national wealth share. In 2022, people under 40 held just 6.6% of the total national wealth.
6.6%.
Back in 1992, that same age group held 10.5%.
So a clear decline. Younger generations are accumulating less wealth than their parents did at the same age.
Undeniably. The data shows it quite clearly.
So the crucial question becomes, what are the real-world consequences of all this?
They're huge. This debt burden demonstrably delays major life milestones. Things like getting married, having children, buying a home.
Things that used to be seen as part of a standard life progression.
Right. It impacts birth rates, it erodes that basic sense of stability people need, and it also raises serious ethical questions about education itself.
Like, is it fair?
Yeah. Is it fair to saddle students, especially those from lower income families who often have to take on more debt, with what amounts to a financial trap? A trap that just amplifies the inequalities that were already there.
So it's not just about a delayed start to life.
No, it feels more fundamental. It's like a limit placed on their autonomy right from the beginning. It impacts mental health, long-term planning.
It can turn education, which should be a launch pad,
Into a burden. Exactly.
the personal impact is just so stark. But these individual struggles, they don't happen in isolation, do they? They ripple outwards.
Absolutely. They affect the very foundations of society.
Like democracy itself. What happens when homeownership, which we often think of as a pillar of civic engagement, becomes just out of reach for so many?
Yeah.
What kind of democracy are we building when a majority of people are renting, while a minority is busy accumulating properties purely as investments?
This connection is fascinating, and the data is pretty striking here, too.
Oh.
Look at voting patterns.
Okay,
In the 2022 U.S. midterm elections, 58% of homeowners voted.
58%.
Compare that to renters. Only 37% voted.
Wow, that's a huge gap, 21 points.
It's massive. It means homeowners are significantly overrepresented at the ballot box, and that naturally tilts political decisions towards their interests.
Like what kind of decisions?
Things like zoning laws, property taxes, local development, issues that directly affect property values.
Okay, so why does owning a home make such a difference in participation?
Well, studies suggest a few things. Owning a home tends to increase the likelihood someone will participate in local elections, go to community meetings, because owners feel they have literally something at stake in those local decisions.
A financial stake, a community stake.
Right. Renters, on the other hand, tend to move much more frequently.
How frequently?
On average, maybe every 2-3 years for renters compared to maybe 10-15 years for homeowners.
That's a big difference in stability.
Huge. And that constant mobility makes it harder just practically registering to vote in a new district, learning the local issues. It also fragments community ties. It can erode that sense of belonging and maybe the incentive to try and influence local policies if you don't expect to be there long.
So zooming out, what's the bigger implication of that participation gap?
Well, when the majority of voters are homeowners, it's logical that urban planning, real estate policies, they tend to prioritize protecting existing property values.
Over things like, say, building more affordable housing or strengthening tenant protections.
Potentially, yes. It risks creating what some call an owner democracy, where the interests and perspectives of property owners carry much more weight than those of the growing number of renters.
Especially younger generations who are more likely to be renters.
Exactly.
That's a really powerful challenge to the idea of equal representation, isn't it? It suggests a fundamental aspect of democracy is being discorded.
Leaving a big chunk of the population with less voice in decisions that directly shape their lives.
And speaking of powerful interests shaping things, let's talk about philanthropy.
Ah, yes, the generosity of the super rich.
Is it truly a solution to some of these problems we're discussing? Or is it maybe more of a smokescreen to avoid paying fair taxes?
This is a really critical nuance, and it's often overlooked in the, positive media coverage of big donations.
Okay, break it down.
Well, first, when a millionaire makes a large charitable donation, they get significant tax deductions.
Right.
The way the system works, the federal treasury basically gives up tax revenue. Estimates vary, but it could be between 37 cents and maybe even 74 cents for every single dollar donated that the government doesn't collect in taxes.
So it's subsidized by the public.
In effect, yes. It translates to an estimated $111 billion annually in public subsidy just in the U.S. alone. That's a huge amount.
111 billion. Wow.
And what's interesting is control. When the ultra-rich, create private foundations or use these things called donor-advised funds.
What are those exactly?
They're basically charitable investment accounts. You get the tax break immediately when you put money in, but you can decide later, sometimes much later, where the money actually goes with very little public oversight.
So they retain control.
Significant control over how those resources are allocated. It's not subject to the same public accountability as government spending decided through democratic processes. The strategic direction is set entirely by the donors.
So connecting this to the bigger picture, what's the trade-off?
Well, think about it. A billionaire donates $1 million to their private foundation, and they get the tax break. That's $1 million the state isn't getting to invest in, say, public health or education or infrastructure.
Areas decided by elected representatives theoretically reflecting public will.
Exactly. Private philanthropy picks its own agenda, its own priorities. Public spending, ideally, addresses broader needs determined through a democratic process.
So what's the actual impact then, beyond the specific projects funded?
Well, the media often celebrates these big donations, focusing purely on the generosity.
Sure looks good.
It does. But this can function as a kind of image washing. It can divert attention away from the underlying structural inequalities that maybe created that extreme wealth in the first place. And it subtly reinforces the idea that private charity can or should substitute for collective fiscal responsibility for taxes.
And it becomes an argument against higher taxes.
It absolutely serves as a political argument. Why raise taxes when we're already giving so much voluntarily? It presents private charity as somehow more efficient or better targeted than government programs.
That's a really critical point about the maybe underlying motives or systemic effects. So while some philanthropic efforts definitely do good things,
Undoubtedly.
the system itself allows the wealthy to influence public agendas, get tax breaks, and essentially privatize decisions that could otherwise be public.
That's a fair summary of the critique, yes.
Okay, moving from those big systemic questions back to the deeply personal. You mentioned housing instability earlier.
Yes.
Can an entire generation really build families, build stable communities, if they're stuck in what feels like permanent rental cycles?
The data really shows how deeply connected housing stability is to those fundamental life milestones.
Like starting a family.
Absolutely. When young people can't afford to buy homes, they often delay marriage, they delay having children. Studies clearly link the rising average age of marriage in the U.S. directly to housing instability and high rents.
So it delays family formation, maybe even lowers birth rates.
It can contribute to that, yes. And think about the community aspect. We mentioned renters move frequently.
Every 2-3 years versus 10-15 for owners.
Right. That constant movement makes it incredibly difficult to establish deep roots in a neighborhood, to build those stable community networks that provide support, that create a sense of belonging.
Yeah, you don't invest time and energy if you think you'll be gone soon.
Exactly. Think about neighborhoods where people are constantly moving in and out. Community events might struggle. Local initiatives might lack volunteers. Because fewer people feel truly invested for the long haul. That's a direct outcome.
Okay, so social consequences. What about the economic ones for renters?
Well, the most obvious one is equity. Renters spend a huge chunk of their income, often 25–35%, sometimes more on monthly rent, and none of that builds any wealth for them.
It just goes to the landlord or property owner.
Right? Homeowners, in contrast, are building equity as they pay down their mortgage and as property values hopefully rise. That equity becomes wealth, reinforcing their financial stability, giving them an asset.
An asset they can borrow against or use for retirement?
Or pass on to their children. This lack of an asset cushion makes it much harder for renters to invest in other long-term things, like starting a business or funding their kids' education.
And does it affect civic life too?
It seems to. Housing instability correlates with lower civic participation, things like volunteering, attending school meetings, participating in local groups.
Why is that?
Lacking that stable home base can erode the sense of belonging, that feeling of having a stake in the community's future. And just personally, the constant low-level stress, worrying about rent increases, the possibility of having to move, that creates chronic anxiety. It impacts mental health. It makes it harder to plan for the future.
It's really clear then. Living in perpetual rent isn't just a financial issue. It profoundly affects family life, community connections, economic security. It throws up serious obstacles to stability and social cohesion.
It touches almost every aspect of life.
It really does. That's a powerful insight into the real social costs of housing insecurity. And makes me wonder, zooming out one last time, about the broader promise we were sold.
Global capitalism.
Yeah. Was that project truly meant to bring progress for everyone? Or was it mainly for those who were already positioned to benefit?
It's interesting to look at the origin of that narrative.
The story we were told.
Right. Since the late 20th century, the dominant discourse, neoliberalism, essentially.
Emphasizing free markets, deregulation.
Exactly. That discourse promised that opening up markets, globalization, deregulation, all of this would create wealth and opportunity that would eventually trickle down to everyone, even the most disadvantaged.
The rising tide lifts all boats idea.
That was the promise. But the results? Well, they've been very uneven, highly divergent.
How so?
Well, in some emerging economies like China and India, you definitely saw millions lifted out of extreme poverty, foreign investment, trade. It created a large new middle class. That part happened.
Okay.
But in many other parts of the world, large parts of Africa, Latin America growth was often weak, very dependent on commodity prices, and the wealth that was generated tended to stay concentrated in the hands of existing local elites or transnational corporations.
So uneven benefits globally. What about within developed countries like the US or Europe?
Within developed countries, market openness seems to have primarily benefited those who already had capital financial assets, specific high-demand skills, and ability to adapt quickly.
And the losers?
Meanwhile, workers in traditional manufacturing, certain service sectors, they often faced job displacement, wage stagnation, much more job insecurity. The ground shifted under their feet.
So this brings us back to social mobility. What happened to that promise? The idea that hard work and education would let you climb the ladder.
That's where the promise really seems to fray. What we observe now, quite strongly in the data, is that income and wealth inequality often reproduce across generations.
Meaning, if you're born poor, you're likely to stay poor.
There's much less real mobility, especially upwards from the lower strata, than the narrative would suggest. Your starting point matters enormously. And then you have these cyclical crises.
Like the 2008 financial crash or the recent pandemic.
Exactly. And what those crises reveal, brutally sometimes, is that your ability to recover, to weather the storm, is strongly linked to the wealth and safety nets you already have.
The already benefited bounce back faster, or don't fall as far.
Precisely. They can handle the shocks better.
So ultimately, that promise of prosperity for all from globalization.
It seems far from fulfilled. It looks more like it reinforced the advantages for those who already had capital, connections, adaptability, rather than truly leveling the playing field for everyone.
We've really taken a deep dive today into some uncomfortable but absolutely essential truths about structural inequality.
A lot to digest.
Definitely. And it leaves us, and hopefully you, with a provocative thought to maybe chew on. Is the goal really about making America great again in some broad sense? Or is it perhaps more about consolidating the privilege of a select few?
A challenging question to end on.
It is. And we genuinely want to hear from you. What stands out to you from this deep dive? Did these questions resonate? Did they spark even more uncomfortable questions for you?
We'd love to know your thoughts.
Please share your comments. Join the conversation. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms. Thanks for diving deep with us today.